By the time my family realized they had made the biggest mistake of their lives, it was already too late. 40 relatives sat frozen around a picnic table. My mother couldn't lift her head. My father refused to meet my eyes. My younger sister was crying so hard she couldn't speak. And the same people who had spent my entire life reminding me that I wasn't good enough suddenly couldn't stop begging for my forgiveness, all because of one secret they thought had been buried forever. But to understand why my entire family fell apart that afternoon, you have to go back 4 months, to the Sunday dinner where my own mother looked me straight in the eyes and gave me a choice no daughter should ever have to hear. My name is Natalie Brooks. I'm 34 years old, and for the past 8 years I've made a living feeding people on the happiest and hardest days of their lives. Weddings, baby showers, church festivals, anniversary dinners, funeral receptions. I've prepared thousands of meals that brought strangers together around one table. Ironically, the only table where I never truly belonged was my own family's. Looking back now, I realize my wedding was never supposed to be the happiest day of my life. It was supposed to be the day my family finally proved they could control me. Last June, while everyone else passed bowls of mashed potatoes across the dining room table, my mother quietly slid a sealed envelope toward me. At first I smiled, convinced it was a wedding planner she'd found or maybe a heartfelt note she'd written after hearing about my engagement. Instead, inside was a printed weight loss schedule. Every Monday carefully marked. Every weekly target highlighted in yellow. At the very top, written in thick black letters, were 7 words that made the entire room feel colder. Lose 40 pounds, or there will be no wedding. I actually laughed for a second because I honestly believed it had to be some kind of joke. Then I looked around the table. Nobody smiled. My father kept cutting his roast without lifting his eyes. My younger sister stared into her tea, like it held all the answers she wasn't brave enough to say aloud. Even my aunt quietly reached for another dinner roll, as if this conversation had happened 100 times before. That's when I realized something that hurt more than the words themselves. Everyone at that table already knew. I was the only person hearing it for the first time. My mother folded her napkin neatly into her lap and said, "People won't remember your wedding vows, Natalie. They'll remember how the bride looked in the pictures. I'm trying to save you from embarrassing yourself, and this family." She spoke with the same calm voice she'd used to remind someone to bring dessert to church. No angst, no guilt, just certainty. What none of them knew was that before summer ended, the same woman sitting across from me would secretly spend thousands of dollars canceling my wedding venue behind my back. And even she couldn't have imagined that her decision would push me toward a door our family hadn't opened in nearly 20 years. A door hiding the one person capable of destroying every lie they had spent decades protecting. 7 years earlier I had started my own catering company with $3,500, a rusty delivery van, and more determination than common sense. I called it Hearth and Harvest Catering because I wanted every meal to feel like home, even for people I'd never met before. My kitchen sits inside a renovated brick storefront in Maple Ridge, Indiana, and every morning before sunrise the smell of fresh bread, roasted garlic, and warm butter drifts through the entire neighborhood. Upstairs, in a modest apartment above the shop, I live with the kindest man I've ever known. Ethan Carter, 36 years old, high school history teacher. The type of man who grades papers at my stainless steel prep table, while stealing pieces of fresh bread the moment they come out of the oven. The type of man who thanks me for every single meal, even after years together. When he proposed, it wasn't during an expensive vacation or inside some luxury restaurant. It happened after we'd finished catering a wedding beneath the apple trees at Willow Creek Orchard. My crew was loading tables into the van while the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the hills. Ethan was still wearing black catering gloves because he'd spent an hour helping my employees clean up instead of changing into nice clothes. Then he reached into his apron pocket, pulled out a tiny velvet box, smiled nervously, and started lowering himself onto one knee. I didn't even let him finish the question. I said yes before his knee touched the grass. For a few beautiful hours, life felt exactly the way I'd always dreamed it could. I pictured our wedding beneath those same apple trees. Ethan beside me. My father smiling proudly. My mother wiping away happy tears. My sister laughing while fixing my veil. One perfect family photograph hanging on our wall for the rest of our lives. I truly believed that maybe, just maybe, the hardest chapters of my life were finally behind me. But hope has a cruel habit of disappearing the moment reality walks into the room. That evening we drove to my parents' house to share our news. Before my mother noticed the engagement ring sparkling on my finger, her eyes traveled somewhere else. They stopped at my waist. Less than a second. That's all it took. But I'd spent my entire childhood learning how to recognize that look. She recovered quickly, hugged me tightly, congratulated us, and said October would be a beautiful month for a wedding. To everyone else, she looked like a proud mother. To me, she looked disappointed that I hadn't become someone else before getting engaged. Growing up in the Brooks family taught me one lesson long before I understood algebra or history. My body was never treated like it belonged to me. It belonged to everyone's opinion. Every holiday dinner included 2 tables. The polished dining table where everyone laughed together, and a small folding table beside the kitchen doorway. Officially, my mother always said I sat there because I was such a wonderful helper. In reality, it was where she quietly placed the daughter she believed took up too much space. My dessert plate somehow disappeared before dessert was ever served. My younger sisters never did. At first I hated that little folding table. Eventually, it became the place where I discovered the only thing nobody could ever take away from me: cooking. If they insisted on leaving me beside the stove every holiday, then I would learn everything that stove could teach me. By 17, I could prepare meals that had church ladies begging my mother for recipes she'd never actually cooked herself. They praised her talent. She accepted every compliment with a smile. And I stood silently in the kitchen washing dishes, convincing myself that maybe the next meal would finally earn the love I'd been chasing my whole life. It never did. Even after building a successful business, I catered every family gathering without accepting a single dollar. Birthdays, graduation parties, Thanksgiving, Christmas, memorial services, and every September, our enormous family reunion at Ashwood Lake. Nearly 40 relatives, hundreds of homemade dishes, thousands of dollars in food and supplies. I told myself I was simply being generous. The truth was much harder to admit. I was still trying to buy a seat at a table that had never truly been mine. Every reunion ended exactly the same way. Children laughing across the grass, adults sharing stories beneath the trees, and one empty folding chair standing quietly near the end of the family table. Nobody ever sat there. Nobody ever moved it. And nobody was allowed to ask who it belonged to. Every family hides one story they're terrified of telling. Mine hid it in an empty chair. I had no idea that before summer ended, I would finally discover whose place had been waiting all those years. Before I could fold the weight loss plan and push it back across the table, I looked directly into my mother's eyes and asked one simple question. And what if I refuse? The smile disappeared from her face. Her answer wasn't just about my wedding. It became the first move in a war that would tear our entire family apart. My mother folded her hands together so calmly you'd think she was about to say grace instead of threatening her own daughter's wedding. Then there won't be a wedding, she said with a gentle smile that somehow hurt more than shouting ever could. Not one will attend, and certainly not one will help pay for. I refused to spend the rest of my life looking at photographs that embarrassed this family. The words landed between the dinner plates like broken glass. My father remained silent. My sister Emily stared at the table, pretending not to hear a conversation that had clearly been discussed long before I arrived. I slowly placed my fork beside my plate and looked directly at my mother. I'm marrying Ethan this October, I said as calmly as I could. And I'm marrying him exactly as I am today. If anyone is embarrassed by the bride, they're welcome to stay out of the pictures. For the first time that evening, Emily's spoon stopped moving. My mother's smile never faded. She leaned back in her chair, folded her napkin with perfect precision, and quietly delivered the sentence she'd been waiting all night to say. That's your choice, sweetheart. But remember, the venue belongs to me. She knew exactly what those words would do. Months earlier she'd surprised everyone by announcing she'd already reserved Willow Creek Manor for our wedding. She called it her wedding gift before Ethan or I had even visited the property. The deposit, $4,000, had already been paid. Contracts signed. Dates confirmed. Every decision made without asking the two people actually getting married. At the time I'd convinced myself it was generosity. Looking back, it was simply the first move in a game I didn't realize we were playing. As someone who owns a business, paperwork matters to me. Signatures matter. Ownership matters. Only 3 days after she booked the venue, I called the event manager, a kind woman named Allison, hoping to have my name added to the contract. I explained that I wanted everything legally transferred so Ethan and I could manage our own wedding plans. Allison sounded genuinely apologetic. Company policy allowed only one contracting client for each event. Every decision had to come from the original signer. There were no exceptions. That same afternoon, I drove straight to my parents' house carrying a certified check for the entire deposit. I offered to repay every dollar so the reservation could be placed under my name instead. My mother looked almost offended. She pressed one hand dramatically against her chest and pushed the check back across the counter. "Absolutely not," she said. "This is my gift to my daughter. Don't insult me by trying to buy it." At the time I accepted that answer because it sounded reasonable. It even sounded loving. But deep inside, something didn't feel right. There was a quiet ache I kept ignoring because I desperately wanted peace. Wedding planning is supposed to bring families together, and I kept convincing myself that questioning my mother's intentions would make me the difficult one. It wasn't until much later that I finally admitted the truth to myself. A gift you aren't allowed to control isn't really a gift at all. It's control wrapped in beautiful paper. When Ethan came home that evening, I told him everything. He didn't interrupt me once. He simply listened while I repeated every word my mother had said. Then he became unusually quiet. Most people would mistake that silence for calm. I knew better. Ethan only went silent when he was trying very hard not to say something he'd regret. After a long pause, he finally looked at me and smiled sadly. "When I asked you to marry me," he said, "I asked the woman standing in front of me. Every part of her. I don't remember asking for someone else's version." I laughed through tears because that single sentence carried more acceptance than I'd received from my own family in years. His parents couldn't have been more different from mine. His mother only wanted to know two things after we announced the engagement: what food we were serving, and whether she could bring her famous lemon cake. That was her entire list of demands. No conditions. No criticism. No measuring tape disguised as concern. Just excitement. The difference between our families hurt more than I wanted to admit. Still, I wasn't ready to give up on mine. A few days later I drove back to my parents' house alone. I had rehearsed the conversation all morning while delivering catering orders. I told myself there had to be a compromise. Sitting across from my mother in her spotless kitchen, I calmly explained that I was willing to hire a personal trainer if it truly made her feel better. Not to become smaller, but to become stronger. Health made sense. Confidence made sense. But there would be no weekly weigh-ins, no target number, and certainly no deadline connected to whether I deserved to get married. I honestly believed it was a fair offer. She listened without interrupting, her head tilted slightly like she was patiently waiting for a child to finish complaining. Then she sighed. "You honestly think I'm being cruel?" she asked softly. "Natalie, I'm the only person in your life brave enough to tell you the truth before the rest of the world does." She reached across the table and gently patted my hand. People can be vicious toward women who stop taking care of themselves. A good mother protects her daughter before strangers have the chance to judge her. She truly believed every word she said. That was the frightening part. She didn't think she was controlling me. She believed she was rescuing me. In her world, criticism was love. Shame was motivation. And unconditional acceptance was simply bad parenting. Before I left, she reminded me of one final thing. "The 4th of July cookout is only a few weeks away," she said. "The whole family will be there. That's when you'll give me your answer. In front of everyone." It wasn't an invitation. It was a public deadline. My mother understood something better than anyone in town. In Maple Ridge, reputation mattered almost as much as faith. She had spent nearly 20 years leading church hospitality events, organizing community dinners, deciding which family stories deserved to be celebrated, and which quietly disappeared before Sunday service. She protected the Brooks family image with military precision. Every September she hosted our massive family reunion at Ashwood Lake, where nearly 40 relatives gathered beneath the same pavilion every single year. I supplied every tray of food, every dessert, every serving table. My crew worked from sunrise until afternoon while relatives complimented my mother's beautiful event. She accepted every compliment without once mentioning who had actually prepared the meal. I told myself it didn't matter because family was supposed to help each other. Looking back, I wasn't helping. I was earning approval that never arrived. Every reunion ended exactly the same way. Children laughing beside the lake. Adults playing horseshoes. My mother sitting proudly at the head table. And one empty folding chair standing quietly near the edge of the pavilion with its back facing the water. No one ever sat there. No one ever moved it. The single time I'd asked about it years earlier, the entire conversation had stopped. Plates stopped moving. Smiles disappeared. My Aunt Diane suddenly stood up and began clearing dishes that weren't even dirty. The silence that followed lasted less than a minute, but somehow it answered my question better than words ever could. That chair wasn't empty because someone had forgotten to use it. It was empty because my family was terrified of remembering who it belonged to. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the empty chair. The next morning, while organizing old catering invoices in my office, I found something that had accidentally been packed into one of my grandmother's recipe boxes years earlier. It wasn't a recipe. It was an old family photograph. And the person sitting in that empty chair had been carefully cut out of the picture. The question about that empty chair stayed with me long after the reunion ended. At first, I convinced myself it was just another strange family tradition. One of those things nobody bothered explaining because that's how it's always been. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized there was another absence that felt even louder. My grandmother, my mother's own mother, didn't exist in our family's conversations. No birthday cards. No Christmas stories. No photographs on the hallway wall. No phone calls. Nothing. She wasn't dead. Dead relatives were remembered with casseroles, old photographs, and stories told around the Thanksgiving table. My grandmother received something far colder than death. She had been erased, as if she had never belonged to the Brooks family at all. At the time, I had no idea that before the year ended, I would learn exactly what kind of woman my family erased, and why they were so desperate to make sure nobody ever asked about her again. The 4th of July arrived with perfect weather, and the kind of fake smiles only families know how to wear. More than 20 relatives crowded my parents' backyard. Children chased each other through sprinklers while my uncles argued over the grill. To everyone else, it looked like another picture-perfect holiday. To me, it felt like walking onto a stage where everyone already knew the script except the person meant to be humiliated. I hadn't even finished greeting everyone before my mother made her move. As the buffet line formed, she walked toward me carrying a plate she'd prepared herself. Steamed vegetables, plain grilled chicken, cottage cheese. Not a single bite of the barbecue everyone else was enjoying. Then, loud enough for nearly the entire backyard to hear, she held it out with a bright smile. "Here's the bride's plate," she announced cheerfully. "We're all helping Natalie get ready for those wedding photos." Laughter rippled through a few corners of the yard. One uncle chuckled into his drink. Someone called out, "You've got this." Another cousin smiled awkwardly as if public humiliation counted as encouragement. I could actually hear lawn chairs creaking as people shifted to watch what happened next. This wasn't kindness. It wasn't concern. It was a performance. My mother had already heard my answer in May. She'd heard it again a week later. So now she was asking one more time. Only this time she wanted an audience. I looked at the plate without touching it. Then I calmly said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, "There isn't a weight loss plan. There isn't a deadline. And my wedding is still happening exactly as we planned." I gently placed the untouched plate back onto the buffet table. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult her. I simply refused to participate in the performance she'd created. Somehow, that hurt her more than shouting ever could. Within seconds, her expression changed. Her eyes filled with tears. Her lower lip trembled ever so slightly. I'd seen that performance before too. Less than 2 minutes later, 3 of my aunts had gathered around her, rubbing her shoulders while looking at me like I'd committed some unforgivable crime. "She's only trying to help," one of them whispered loudly enough for me to hear. Another shook her head in disappointment. Somehow the woman who had just publicly shamed her own daughter became the victim. And I became the cruel one for refusing to play along. I actually caught myself beginning to apologize. "I'm sorry if my tone." The words almost escaped before I realized what I was doing. I wasn't apologizing because I'd done something wrong. I was apologizing because I'd disrupted the version of reality my family preferred. For the first time in my life, I stopped the apology before it left my mouth. It sounds like a small thing now, but that unfinished sentence stayed with me for weeks. It was the first crack in years of conditioning. 2 weeks later, while frosting cupcakes for a graduation party, an email notification appeared on my phone. The subject line stopped me cold. "We're sorry to hear about your wedding postponement." I stared at the screen, convinced it had been sent to the wrong person. Then I opened it. The message was from Allison, the event coordinator at Willow Creek Manor. She wrote kindly, saying she hoped everything was okay and that if Ethan and I ever wanted to reschedule in the future, she'd be happy to help us find another available date. My hands instantly went cold. I called her before I even finished reading the email. Her voice carried genuine sympathy. She explained that my mother had personally visited the venue 4 days after the 4th of July cookout. She canceled the reservation herself. The entire $4,000 deposit had been forfeited. Because October dates were in high demand, another couple had signed the contract before lunchtime that same day. Our wedding date was gone. Permanently. Allison apologized over and over, because she'd assumed I already knew. The contract holder had assured everyone the family had agreed to postpone the wedding. The family had agreed. I stood alone in my kitchen with the phone pressed against my ear, while absent-mindedly brushing melted butter across the same clean baking tray again and again. My hands needed something to do, because my mind couldn't accept what I'd just heard. The hardest part wasn't losing the venue. It wasn't even losing $4,000. It was realizing my mother hadn't accidentally ruined my wedding. She had deliberately paid $4,000 to stop it from happening. She didn't lose that money. She spent it. She decided controlling me was worth every penny. If someone had asked her later, she'd probably describe it as a sacrifice made out of love. But standing there in my kitchen, I finally understood what it really was. She would rather destroy something beautiful than allow me to make my own decision. I drove straight to my parents' house with the email still open on my phone. My mother was outside trimming flowers as though nothing unusual had happened. She didn't even remove her gardening gloves when I confronted her. "You canceled my wedding," I said quietly. She barely looked up. "No," she answered. "I postponed it. Think of it as motivation. You'll thank me when you see the spring photographs." Her voice was so calm it was almost unsettling. Then she casually mentioned something that hit even harder than the cancellation itself. She'd already told everyone. My aunts, my cousins, church friends, members of the hospitality committee. Everyone had been informed that my wedding was postponed for health reasons. She never mentioned my name or my weight directly. She didn't have to. In a town as small as Maple Ridge, people could finish that sentence without any help. Before I'd even learned my wedding had been canceled, she'd already rewritten the story and shared it with the entire community. And in a small town, whoever tells the story first usually owns the truth. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed my father standing quietly inside the open garage. He held an old shop rag in his hands, rubbing at a stain that didn't exist. For one brief second he looked at me. I saw guilt behind his eyes. Regret. Maybe even shame. Then, just as quickly, he lowered his head and returned his attention to the rag. That was the moment something inside me finally changed. I stopped waiting for my father to rescue me. I stopped believing silence was temporary. After 30 years of living beside a woman who controlled every room she entered, he'd chosen survival over courage. And whether he realized it or not, that choice had become its own answer. That evening, Ethan asked me one simple question I couldn't answer. If your mother is willing to destroy your wedding just to prove she's right, what do you think she'll do next when she realizes you're still refusing to obey? I thought canceling my wedding was the worst thing my mother could possibly do. I was wrong, because 3 days later, a package arrived at my office with no return address. Inside was an old photograph, and written across the back were 6 words that would change everything. Ask why your grandmother disappeared. For the next few days, I couldn't stop replaying my conversation with my father in the driveway. The silence in his eyes haunted me more than my mother's words ever could. I kept wondering if he'd always been this afraid, or if years of surrender had simply taught him that surviving was easier than speaking. Then, late one Tuesday night, my phone buzzed across the stainless steel counter, while I was finishing inventory in the kitchen. Emily. The message contained only one sentence. Can I come over? Please don't tell Mom. ***. 20 minutes later she slipped into the shop through the back entrance, glancing over her shoulder before locking the door behind her. She climbed onto the prep table stool where she'd spent so many afternoons as a teenager watching me decorate cakes. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. Finally she looked down at her hands and quietly said, "Nat, maybe you should just do what Mom wants." She didn't say give up. She didn't say let her win. She simply said, life is easier when she's happy. I studied my little sister's face. 30 years old, raising her daughter, Lily, almost entirely on her own, working full-time, smiling through exhaustion. She looked healthy to anyone passing by, until you noticed how loose her wristwatch had become. While we talked, she reached into her purse and pulled out a tiny bag of almonds. 6. Exactly 6. She ate them one at a time, slowly, carefully, as though every bite required permission. Without thinking, I asked, "When was the last time you ate a slice of bread in front of Mom?" She laughed automatically. Then the smile disappeared. Neither of us answered, because neither of us could remember. I leaned back against the counter and quietly said, "I've spent my entire life trying to earn Mom's approval. 34 years, and somehow I'm still taking the entrance exam." Emily looked away. She picked up the small pastry box I'd packed for Lily, fresh apple turnovers covered in cinnamon sugar. Without realizing it, she turned the box over, searching for the nutrition label. The moment I saw that, something inside me changed. All my anger toward her disappeared. Emily wasn't helping Mom because she agreed with her. She was surviving the only way she'd ever been taught. She wasn't the guard. She was another prisoner, just one with slightly better privileges. Before leaving, she hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. Then she whispered the sentence I'd heard my entire childhood. "Mom loves us, she just has her own way of showing it." I watched her drive away, and for the first time I understood something heartbreaking. You don't blame another person who's drowning beside you. You simply realize you've both been trying to survive the same storm. I wish I could tell you that conversation made me stronger. It didn't. The truth is much harder to admit. 3 nights later, just after midnight, I almost surrendered. The kitchen was completely silent except for the soft clicking sounds of the cooling ovens. My wedding binder lay open across the stainless steel prep table. Beside it sat my laptop, and glowing on the screen was an 8-week weight loss program. I'd made it myself. Healthy meals, exercise schedule, weekly weigh-ins, progress chart, every page perfectly organized, every column neatly aligned. Somehow, even my surrender looked professional. In another browser tab I'd started writing a message to my mother. The first sentence read, **, maybe we can find a compromise. **, compromise. Imagine trying to negotiate with someone who believed your worth could be measured on a bathroom scale. I stared at the screen for several minutes before I heard the back door open. It was Rosa, my executive chef, 42 years old, mother of 3, a woman who had survived more hardship than anyone I knew and still somehow laughed louder than everyone else. She'd forgotten her jacket. The moment she stepped inside, she took one look at me, one look at the glowing laptop, and understood everything. Without asking a single question, she walked over, reached across the table, and gently closed my laptop. You spend every day feeding everyone else's celebrations, she said softly. Then she looked me straight in the eyes. But who's feeding you, Natalie? That sentence broke something inside me. Not because it was dramatic. Because nobody had ever asked me that before. I cried right there in the middle of my own kitchen. Not because I'd lost a wedding venue. Not because $4,000 had disappeared. Not even because of my mother. I cried because I had just caught myself doing exactly what she trained me to do. I was preparing to punish myself. Before she even had the chance. Rosa stayed until I finished locking up. Neither of us spoke much. Sometimes the kindest people understand that silence is also a language. The following morning I deleted the meal plan. Then I deleted the message to my mother. Instead, I sent her something much shorter. Asterisk, I'll stop by Saturday to collect the rest of my wedding paperwork. Asterisk, one thing still belonged to me, and I wanted it back. Saturday morning my parents were both volunteering at the annual church picnic. Exactly where the church bulletin said they'd be. I still had a key to the house where I'd grown up. Before leaving, I'd texted my mother. She replied almost immediately. Asterisk, everything's in the dining room sideboard. Asterisk, important documents had always been stored there. Looking back, control had been stored there too. The house was completely silent when I walked inside. The furniture looked untouched. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and fresh flowers. Nothing ever seemed out of place inside that house, except the people living in it. My wedding box waited exactly where she'd said it would. Vendor contracts, guest lists, invitation samples, budget notes. Every piece of my wedding, filed under my mother's supervision. I hugged the box against my side and started toward the front door. Then, an old drawer above the cabinet suddenly slid open on its own. It had always stuck whenever I was growing up. This time it slipped completely off its track. Several old photo albums tumbled onto the floor. Instinctively I knelt to put everything back before anyone noticed. As I lifted the top album, a single loose photograph slid free and landed face up on the hardwood floor. Black and white, faded around the edges. A young girl, maybe 8 years old, standing stiffly beside an unfamiliar kitchen doorway. At first nothing seemed unusual. Then I looked closer. Written neatly beneath the picture, in faded pencil, was a number. 58 pounds. I frowned. Picked up another photograph. Different year. Different dress. Another number. I pulled open the nearest album. Its cover read, Sandra, 1972. I slowly turned the first page. Then the second. Then the third. Every photograph of my mother had a handwritten weight recorded underneath it. Every single one. And in that silent dining room, I finally realized my mother's obsession with controlling me had never actually started with me. As I turned the next page, the numbers suddenly stopped. There was only one photograph, one empty chair, and 6 handwritten words beneath it. She left before the reunion began. I had no idea who she was, but I was about to find out, and it would explain everything my family had spent 20 years trying to erase. You think the wedding was the ending? It wasn't. It was only the beginning. In part 2, a shocking family secret comes to light. Old betrayals finally catch up with the people who caused them, and one unexpected moment changes everything forever. If this story has touched your heart so far, don't stop here. Subscribe now and turn on notifications, because part 2 delivers the ending no one sees coming.